So what is a stunted fish? I wanted to make this video because there's quite a lot of confusion and myths on the internet and on YouTube. What is a stunted fish? Why it happens? Why does a discus or altum angel or angelfish becomes stunted? How to fix that situation? Is it reversible? Can you actually make a stunted fish to grow? Some people are saying that stunting of fish, stunted growth of your fish occurs because of intestinal worms. Others say that it's because of poor water quality, poor husbandry. There's lots of various claims and theories as to how to deal with this problem. Some say that a stunted fish can regain its growth and it can become a healthy, thriving fish. Others would say that no, it's not possible. All of these claims are basically based on individual assumptions and all sorts of individual experiences. So in this video we are not going to rely only on individual assumptions. I will talk about my experience, I will talk about examples that I currently have, but most of this information that I'm telling you right now is based on scientific studies on stunted growth in fish. So this is a couple of articles that I would recommend, but particularly the first one is certainly the most respectable and reliable source of scientific information on stunted growth in fish. I will start with a definition. So what is a stunted growth in fish? Only a juvenile fish can get stunted. So it's a fish that hasn't yet reached its breeding size and its breeding age. It's a juvenile that still keeps on growing. Only that kind of fish can get stunted. An adult fish which has reached its adult size, it cannot get stunted because it has reached its adult size. Only a juvenile can be described as a stunted fish. So it's a fish that for a certain reason, and I will talk about this reason a moment later, has stopped growing at a particular moment in its life. Once it has stopped growing, it continues to be a healthy fish, it continues to be a healthy individual that most likely will have very bright colors, the same as a normal fish, the same as a normal adult fish. It will have very decent body shape, it's going to feed, it most likely is going to breed, but it's never going to reach its normal regular adult size. So it's going to be much smaller than a regular individual of the same species. This phenomenon is also called a dwarfism. So the fish becomes a miniature version of the same fish. It's a healthy fish, it's going to live as long as a normal adult fish of the same species, but it's not going to grow. So this is what we call a stunted fish. So most often in aquarium hobby we observe stunting in discus, altum angels and wild forms of altums and some other cichlids. Yes, certainly other species of aquarium fish can also get stunted, but it doesn't happen as often as in discus and altums. If you are in discus breeding, in discus hobby, you have probably heard the term stunted discus a lot of times, because it does happen very often in discus. So why do fish get stunted? Most of the studies that are available, most of the research that has been done on stunting, on stunted growth in freshwater fish, point out that there is only one major reason why fish get stunted. This is resource limitations. This is how they call it in this study. So what does it mean for us hobbyists, a resource limitation? It means that fish doesn't get enough food for a certain period of time while they are still juveniles and while they need to be feeding regularly, while they need to be feeding a lot in order to maintain a certain level of growth. If they don't get enough food, if they don't get enough resource to grow at that stage, they are not going to grow, and that's why they become stunted. So the major reason of stunting in freshwater fish, as identified by scientific research and by those studies which I've showed you earlier, is a so-called resource limitation, the lack of food. As it happens in discus very often, you have a shoal of discus, you have like 10 of them, 6 of them, they all compete for food. They are stronger individuals, they're weaker individuals, and weaker individuals may not get an equal access to food, so they may get less food than stronger individuals. And as they become weaker, as they don't get enough food, they lose their order in the pecking order. They just get bullied, so they are afraid to come out during the feeding times. It means that they continue starving and their stunting becomes permanent. So if they don't get food for a week, that's normal. They can handle this. But if they don't get food for several weeks in a row, it is likely that they will become stunted if they are juveniles, if they are juvenile individuals. The same happens in Altum angels. If they don't get enough food when they're juveniles for a certain period of time, for more than 2 weeks continuously, they are likely to become stunted. So particularly in discus, the cause of their stunting is competition for food and inability of certain individuals to compete for food and to get enough food in order to establish hierarchy within the shoal, in order to establish their dominance vis-a-vis other individuals, and they become weaker, they become smaller, and they're bullied, they don't get enough access to food, so they get stunted. This is a major cause of stunting in freshwater fish. So what about intestinal worms? What about flagellates? Certainly they inhibit growth in freshwater fish and aquarium fish, particularly in discus and in other cichlids. Lots of people on the internet, on YouTube, argue that stunted growth in discus, stunted growth in other aquarium fish is caused by intestinal worms. But we have to draw a line. Intestinal worm problem is a different issue from stunting. If your fish has intestinal worms, it keeps on feeding, but it doesn't feed enough, and it keeps on becoming thinner. Eventually it becomes razor thin. It has this whitish poop. It's just slowly dying. If it's left untreated, if you don't treat intestinal worms, flagellates, your fish will eventually die. If you have a juvenile discus, a juvenile Altum fish, it's going to die from intestinal worms probably within a matter of 1 month. If you have an adult fish that has intestinal worms, it's going to die within probably a couple of months. Maybe it's going to last for 3 months or 4 months, something like that. But eventually, over a span of several months, it's going to die. It's not going to survive if it's left untreated. Stunting is a different condition. It's not an illness, it's not a disease. So your fish, your stunted fish, is not going to die. It will continue living, and it will have bright colors. It will probably breed as well. So it's not lethal. Stunting is not lethal for fish. That's why we have to distinguish it from intestinal worms. Intestinal worms will kill your fish. They're not going to just stunt it. Certainly, if your fish has intestinal worms, it's not going to grow. It's going to become thinner and thinner, and it's going to die. Your stunted fish is not going to be razor thin. It's not probably going to be very plump and bulky, but it's also not going to be razor thin. It's just going to be very similar to a normal, regular adult discus or angelfish, but much smaller than it should be at its age. What about water quality? Certainly water quality, high ammonia, high nitrates, nitrites, they certainly inhibit growth in fish. So they could be a cause of stunting. Not necessarily. What happens if you keep your fish in bad quality of water? So if you have high ammonia, if you have high nitrates and even nitrites, your fish eventually is going to die. Yes, it is also going to stop feeding at a certain period of time, and in a way it will get stunted. But unlike stunting, unlike stunted growth, bad husbandry, bad water conditions are going to lead to the demise and death of your fish. So your fish can last probably several weeks or probably a month in a really bad water, in a water of really bad quality with high levels of ammonia, most likely it's not going to last more than a week, but in some cases it can survive for a certain period of time, but it is eventually going to die. Yes, you can remove your fish, you can put it in much better water conditions, and your fish will survive and it will continue growing, but yes, it can get also stunted after this ammonia poisoning, if it survives ammonia poisoning. But poor water conditions, they are not necessarily a cause of stunting. They can inhibit the growth of your fish, but eventually, if you manage to recover your fish, if you manage to move them to better conditions, to adequate conditions, the decreased growth will not be permanent. So is stunting reversible? Is it a permanent condition? Can we do something with a stunted fish to make it grow? It depends. Most of the research on freshwater fish, on stunted growth in freshwater fish, has focused on cold water fish, on salmon, on perch, on Atlantic char, and all sorts of other cold water fish. What happens in cold water is that all processes are much slower. The fish organs, the fish body functions much slower than in warmer temperatures, than in warmer water. So in most cases, when we talk about cold water fish, stunting can be reversed. So because it will take that particular fish a really long time to get fully stunted, to reach the condition of dwarfism. So before this condition becomes permanent, it can be resuscitated, so to say. It can continue growing if there is enough food, and it will grow into properly sized adult fish. Well, the things are different in warm water situation, particularly when we talk about discus or altum angels and other cichlids that are kept at higher temperatures. So as we know, at higher temperatures everything happens much faster. All the processes within fish body happen much faster than at cold water temperatures. So stunting can become permanent and irreversible much faster at warmer temperatures. Let's talk about discus. If your smaller juvenile discus doesn't get access to food for a few days, for a week, the condition is still reversible. You can remove it from the shoal, you can put it in a different tank with a smaller fish, with different fish. You can feed it enough and it can regain its growth, it can continue growing. But if that fish didn't get enough food for several weeks, for a month, then the condition will be permanent. You can move it later on to another aquarium, you can try to feed it, you can try to do lots of water changes, but nothing is going to happen because that dwarfism, that stunting condition has become permanent already. It's been long enough since this fish stopped feeding properly, since it stopped having access to a sufficient amount of resources in order to sustain its growth. So if we talk about a month, that's too late. You won't be able to make your fish grow back to its normal size, so it will remain stunted for the rest of its life. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with stunted fish. The only thing that clearly distinguishes them from other fish of the same species is large eyes. In fish, eyes keep on growing. The rest of the body, the rest of the organs will stop growing, but eyes will continue growing, and you will notice that stunted fish, they have really large eyes as compared to their body size. And they will be quite brightly colored for their size. If you compare them to other juveniles of the same size, these fish, they will clearly be older than the rest of the juveniles, so they will have more colors. And these are the two things that will distinguish a stunted fish. Large eyes as compared to their body, and bright colors. So if you're shopping for discus fish, for example, and if you see some juveniles, well, juvenile sized discus that are really brightly colored and they have big eyes, most likely this is stunted fish. most likely they've been stunted for a while. So if you buy this fish, this is what you get. They're not going to grow much. They might grow like just an inch or something like that, but they're not going to develop into fully sized adult fish. Alright, so I want to show you my own example of stunted fish. You might have seen, if you follow my blog, that 2 months ago we bought new juvenile Altum angels, Orinoco Altums. They arrived quite thin, quite emaciated. They had sunken bellies, relatively large eyes for their size as well. From the very start they did feed, but not very actively. They never ate sufficiently. It's been 2 months ever since, and I can say for sure that these Altum angels are stunted. Over these 2 months they didn't gain any size at all, so they did not grow at all. They remained the same size they used to be. I fed them a variety of food, frozen foods, live foods, dry foods, everything that my other Altums will eat. They did eat a bit of everything, but not much, so they didn't feed to the same level as my other Altums would. I've dewormed them at least 4 times. I've increased the temperature to over 30 degrees a few times. I've done massive water changes, nothing seems to work. So my assumption is that they've been stunted before I bought them. So I've bought them from a reputable seller, a reputable retailer, but apparently they've been with this retailer for quite a while, and as it often happens with retailers, especially larger aquatic retailers, employees very often simply don't feed the fish enough. They just don't care. So some of the more delicate fish, they don't get enough food, especially if they're kept in the same tank with other fish. And that means that if they stay for like a month with that retailer, there is a huge chance that they will get stunted. And this is what I believe happened with my Altum angels. They've got stunted well before I bought them, and now there's just nothing I can do. They don't grow. I've fed them lots of other stuff, and food is not an issue, water quality is not an issue, temperature is not an issue. So their condition, sadly, is now permanent. Yes, it's a sad reality, and there doesn't seem to be anything that I can do except just trying to take good care of them, but most likely they will never reach the same size as my other Altums. They are healthy, they are interested in food, they swim around, they are active, but they just don't feed as much as others, and they don't grow at all. So they've been the same size as I bought them. So I hope this video was useful. The most important thing about stunted growth in fish that you have to remember, that the reason of stunting, the main reason of stunting, is the lack of food, the lack of access to food in juvenile fish. If your juvenile Altums, discus or other cichlids, or maybe other fish as well, don't get sufficient access to food for prolonged periods of time, they will get stunted and the condition will be irreversible. If you notice that your juvenile discus do not get enough food, and if you notice it earlier, I would recommend to deal with the situation as soon as possible. If it's still at early stages, you would be able to make this fish eat again and grow again. So it's not going to be finite at this stage. Right, so I hope this video was useful. Do leave your comments in the comment section about your own experience with stunted growth in fish, and whether you actually have some other theories as to why fish get stunted. And I'll see you in other videos soon.